So one of the big debates which progressives have been engaged in more recently is whether or not or in what way we'll be supporting Joe Biden when it comes to the general election. And AOC decided to go on The View and really educate Joy Behar when it comes to what it might take to win over the progressive movement. So let's take a look at that, then we're going to come back and talk about it.
Congresswoman, some progressives are suggesting that with Bernie out of the race, they'll vote third party. That would be a catastrophe, in my opinion. What do you say to those people? And also, part two, Biden has made some efforts to appeal to progressives, like lowering the eligibility age for Medicare to 60 and expanding student debt forgiveness. Is that enough?
So I think. Thank you. Yes, I think, and I think that they're connected questions. As I think what's really important is that we do realize that at the end of the day, one of these two candidates are going to be elected president of the United States. It's either going to be Joe Biden or it's going to be Donald Trump. And I think it's important to, communicate some empathy. I know for a lot of people, this was not the outcome that they may have wanted, and this was not the choice that they wanted to make. But ultimately, when it comes to those two, I don't think it's particularly close in terms of what communities will be made more vulnerable. And I think but what I also think is really important is that the way to I think move in a unifying direction, as I said before, is that unity isn't a feeling, it's a process. And I think that that Biden can go further. I think that it's not necessarily enough. Lowering Medicare to 60 by 5 years is still more conservative than what Hillary Clinton proposed in 2016. Hillary was talking about lowering it to 50 4 years ago. And so I think that there's certainly room. I think that there's going to be room on issues like immigration, Puerto Rico, healthcare, climate change. And I think that it's healthy to do that. And I think it's what we shouldn't do is recreate this dynamic where we are kind of finger wagging and nagging people into voting because it's not a way of generating enthusiasm. I think one thing that we can do is improve the policies that we have as a party to tell young people, to tell all sorts of people, we see you and we have a plan for you, and we're going to create hope for all sorts of communities in the United States.
So one of the major distinctions which we've really been seeing come out of the progressive movement, or at least some progressives in the movement over the past couple days, past weeks since Bernie Sanders dropped out, is that there must be a meaningful distinction between an endorsement and a vote. And you saw AOC explicating something along that lines in that interview there. I mean, we saw this article come out, AOC, when it comes to a Biden endorsement, look, we'll see. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. While simultaneously going around saying that, look, I've always said that I'll be supporting the Democratic nominee. And there seems to be an obvious philosophical distinction contained here, which is that, a vote does not entail an endorsement. But there's also a bit of a practical distinction here, which is that, when it comes to an endorsement, that entails certain kind of resources, a certain amount of effort, additional resources, additional effort, etc., which would be expended on a campaign, which may not be otherwise if you do not, in fact, win the endorsement. We saw this letter come out from a number of progressive youth groups as soon as Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race, saying, look, these are our lists of, policies, these are our list of demands, and if you don't do these things, then you're not going to get our final endorsement, and it's going to be really hard for you to turn around and win the youth groups. Now, win the youth vote. Now, some of these progressive groups are saying that, look, we'll be spending we'll be expending a number of resources on the Joe Biden campaign regardless. But other progressive groups, other progressive youth groups are saying, look, no, unless you do certain things, then you are not going to see those specific resources that we have allocated, sort of going towards your campaign. You just won't see that resources. Now, our voter, I might vote for you, but you won't get those resources. So that's one of the distinctions which we've been seeing come out of at least some progressives in the movement. You might disagree with that distinction, but that is a distinction which we're seeing, and it is more or less one of those, AOC is explicating something along those lines in that video. Now, the other thing, though, that I want to talk about is that something that really worries me when it comes to the progressive movement, at least for the long run, is that there's a number of progressives out there who I've seen who are really kind of conflate the progressive movement with with electoral politics, conflating the progressive movement with the number of, sort of progressives who we get into Congress, the number of progressives who, support Medicare for all, refuse to take corporate PAC money. How many of those people can we get into Congress? And that's something that really, really worries me when it comes to the long run success of the progressive movement. Because, guys, politicians are politicians. AOC at some point very likely will turn around and endorse Joe Biden once she believes that she's gotten as many concessions as she possibly can from Joe Biden. Now, and I imagine that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be upset at her for doing that, and I'm probably not going to be happy with it either. I'll probably, when I first see it, I'll be really upset about it. But we also have to be sympathetic to the situation which AOC sees herself in personally, which is that if centrists learn that there's genuinely nothing that they can actually do to win AOC's vote, then in the long run, they're not going to actually try to win AOC's endorsement. Excuse me, I think I said vote last time around. Then they're not going to actually try to win AOC's endorsement, right? And so that could end up weakening AOC's individual influence in Congress, which, you could argue that might not be a particularly good thing, right? So AOC's role as a politician then is to extract as many concessions as possible, but that doesn't mean that the progressive movement itself has to concede on anything, even if they, even if a number of progressives in Congress turn around and endorse or support Joe Biden, right? So progressive movements, like the Sunrise Movement, et cetera, can withhold resources, can basically say, no, we're not going to be endorsing Joe Biden because, look, you got an F on your climate plan. Your climate plan isn't actually sufficient to solve the issues of climate change. So, of course, we can't endorse you, right? But there's another thing which I think goes into this, which is that a lot of, progressives, even really well-meaning, very good progressives who, study left-wing politics, study left-wing thoughts, can sometimes internalize, and I've even caught myself doing this sometimes, internalize aspects of neoliberal sort of ideology, which is that, one of the core central distinctions in neoliberal thought, if not the absolute central distinction in neoliberalism, is a distinction between public and private. Whereas the left has always rejected this distinction, saying that, instead, no, we should evaluate a power structure, evaluate something based on, whether or not that power structure is democratically organized, is that, a legitimate power structure. Whereas, neoliberalism has always said that, look, no, well, it depends on the source of the power. Liberals have, leftists has always said, no, the source of the power is irrelevant. What's relevant is that power democratically organized. But you'll notice that the distinction between public and private cuts explicitly along sort of corporate capitalist lines, right? And so that's where I think that the problem really starts to emerge, where just what it is to be a public thing is to not be a private institution, which, is sort of capitalist, but also public, sort of public institutions, public things are the only sphere of legitimate democratic discourse. And I think that that's really a mistaken way to view politics, right? Like this distinction in itself ends up protecting corporations, protecting capitalist interests. And I think that that's a really big problem. And I think that it's, something that we should really look out for, right? Like, if you're engaged in strikes in your workplace, if you're engaged in pushing your corporation, pushing the company that you work at more, to protect wages, to provide better healthcare, to have a more green, friendly environment, then you are engaged in politics, right? Like, it's not like to only be engaged in politics is to make sure that you go out and vote and extend your civic duty. That's not the only way that you can be engaged in politics. It's just not. Even volunteering at your local food bank. I know that that's an example which I've used a few times on this channel. I think that that is a kind of political action in some sense. And we shouldn't just conflate political action with electoral politics, because what's going to happen is, we're always going to be disappointed, right? The progressive movement will always be disappointed, will always be sad if we just conflate the progressive movement with, the progressives that we can get in through electoral politics, because we're always going to be let down because they're not perfect. They're not, they're not like gods, right? Like progressives going into Congress. Electoral politics is always going to corrupt people. But that doesn't mean, because a lot of leftists look at that and then take away the lesson that we shouldn't be engaged in electoral politics. I don't think that that's right either. I think that we need both. Importantly, one of the things that we've seen over the past couple, weeks with this coronavirus thing is that, there's a lot of time in politics that's just sort of chug, tick tock, where things just happen in Congress and it doesn't feel like anything's changing. It feels like all the persuasion, all the, arguments that we make doesn't amount to anything. But then suddenly moments happen where action can happen, where ideas suddenly matter in Congress. And we saw the ideas that, Congress held, these, deeply neoliberal ideas. But perhaps what we can do is try, through strikes, through organizing, through perhaps the Sunrise Movement, organizing with unions to get unions to engage in strikes, not just for issues of wages, for issues of healthcare, but also because a company's plans and companies, the actions that a company wants to do are not sufficiently environmental, right? Like engaging in strikes that way to influence corporations to do things that way. But, using those other non-governmental, non-electoral politics ways in order to create those moments when political action is possible in Congress, while simultaneously trying to get progressives into Congress. Because the progressive movement, if we're just conflated with electoral politics, will always disappoint us, right? AOC is going to let us down. She just is, right? Like, but that doesn't mean that we need to abandon her, because we also know, or at least I believe, that if Medicare for All came up to a vote, if we were able to get it to a vote, AOC would vote for Medicare for All, right? So what we need to be doing is getting more progressives into Congress while simultaneously organizing to reform corporations, to reform boards in other spheres of life, in other aspects of life, making it possible so that then in Congress, there can be those votes. There can be moments in which we have to do things, where things have to happen, whether that's through general strikes and massive protests, moments where Congress has to act, and then suddenly ideas matter, and suddenly it seems like, those representatives in Congress who would vote for Medicare for All, if given the opportunity, can vote for it, right? So, reform can't just be electoral. Reform can't just be governmental. If we really want to get things done, we have to be engaged in both. We have to be engaged in protests on the street. We have to be engaged in building up left-wing media, new media, and we also have to be engaged in trying to, win seats, trying to persuade people to, run for office, trying to persuade progressives to run for office. And, I am worried sometimes that a number of progressives become a little bit too pessimistic. They become, oh, well, electoral politics can never work. Once you get into government, you become eternally corrupted, and then, you don't end up, you're not perfect, basically. And look, the thing is, yeah, like that is true. They get corrupted. They just do, right? Like they do. You can look at it objectively and they get corrupted. But I don't think that the lesson which we should take away from that is that we should abandon the pursuit of electoral politics. I think instead the lesson we should take away from that is that we should not overly rely on electoral politics, and we should also, use other things, use other means, such as strikes, such as pressuring the Sunrise Movement to, again, like I was saying, convince unions to engage in strikes, not just for issues of wages, for issues of healthcare, but also for environmental movements. And I think that we should hold, the progressive movements outside of electoral politics to a higher standard, right? Like if the Sunrise Movement turns around and endorses Joe Biden, I would be a lot more upset about that than if AOC turns around and endorses Joe Biden after extracting a number of concessions, right? Like that's my point here. I think that we should hold the movements that are engaged outside of electoral politics to a higher standard than we hold AOC to. That's maybe my controversial take, right? Like you might disagree with that. You can let me know your opinion about it, your arguments about it, why you disagree with me down in the comment section. But that's my my sort of opinion on it. So anyway, but if you did like the video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.